Well, hello, and welcome to the webinar today. My name is Carrie Berger, and I'm the coordinator for the Northwest Fire Science Consortium. If you've tuned in to us before, you know that webinars are just one way that the consortium disseminates fire science information to its users, like you. If you haven't been able to tune in to our webinars, check out the archived webinars on our YouTube channel. And so I'm going to go ahead and put the links to our website and YouTube channel in the chat box here in just a second. And it's also important to note that I'll be recording today's webinar. So it's been a busy webinar season for us, and besides today's webinar, the Northwest Fire Science Consortium is hosting 2 more this spring, one on May 7th, where we have Josh Clark with the Washington DNR presenting an outlook for the 2019 fire season in Oregon and Washington. You won't want to miss that one. And also on May 9th, we have Corey Blankenship and Jim Smith from TNC presenting What's New in Land Fire Remap. Also a great one you won't want to miss. So to avoid any noise interference, I have muted your audio. So if you have a question, please type it into the chat box. Okay, so it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Angela Bogue. Angela completed her PhD in environmental studies at the University of Colorado Boulder in December. Her dissertation was entitled Climate Change and Wildfire, Implications for the Forest Management in the Blue Mountains of Eastern Oregon. Her dissertation research included interviews with private forest owners about management responses to climate change, modeling projected changes in forest structure and composition, as well as surveys of post-fire conifer regeneration. She is now a research associate in the Cooperative Institute for Research in Environmental Sciences at CU Boulder, studying climate change impacts in the U.S. Great Plains. Welcome, Angela, and whenever you're ready, go ahead.
Great, thanks, Carrie. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay.
Yeah, you sound great.
Great, thanks. I'm just going to get my screen sharing going. Okay, thanks everyone for joining today. So again, my name is Angela Bogue, and I just finished up my postdoc at the University of Colorado Boulder, or sorry, PhD. I just started my postdoc. And today I'm going to talk about some of my research on post-fire conifer establishment in the Blue Mountains of Eastern Oregon, including findings from data we collected this past summer with support from a Joint Fire Science Program graduate research grant. So if you've joined this webinar, you're probably very familiar with the challenges facing forest and wildfire management in the West. I like to think of the fire problem as a Goldilocks problem. We have too much of certain kinds of fire in some regions and not enough in others. Many regions are suffering from large fire deficits because of fire suppression, as this study by Sean Parks and colleagues shows. And many forested regions, including the Middle Rockies and the Blue Mountains, have millions of acres where dry mixed conifer forests historically burned on a decadal fire return interval. And now many of these areas have experienced regular fire over the last 100 years. And this has contributed to high densities of small trees, which increases vertical fuel continuity and homogenizes forest structure. And I should also apologize, I have a bit of a cold, so yeah, apologize if my voice is a little bit groggy. So partly because of these trends, we've seen a recent increase in the frequency of large wildfires in some areas, such as the 2015 fires in Eastern Oregon. And this photo was taken on a tour of the Coronet Windy Ridge fire, and you can see the high rates of overstory mortality occurring across a large area. And where these large fires burn large areas at high severity, killing most mature trees, there are also concerns about how a warming climate may interact with low seed availability to reduce natural regeneration.
Angela, sorry to interrupt you. I'm not sure you advanced your slides. Did you advance your slides?
I didn't. Oh my gosh. I'm so sorry. Let me stop screen sharing, and I'm just going to kick off from the beginning again. Carrie, how's that?
Yep, I can see your, yep, now I can see, so I see your title slide, but I wasn't seeing that mortality slide that you talked about there. Yep.
Is it
okay,
advancing
perfect.
now? Yep.
Yes, yes, looks great. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Sorry, everyone. First time webinar giver, as you can probably tell. So here, let's start again. So here's that deficit slide that I was talking about. Sorry if you can see it. Again, this Goldilocks problem, we have a fire deficit, which is shown here in blue. In many regions of the West, and then we are seeing an increase in fire activity in other regions. And as I was saying, this fire deficit has led to some areas having a lot more regeneration and fuel continuity than they would have had historically when they had more regular fires. So here's the Coronet Windy Ridge Fire on the Wallowa-Whitman National Forest, just a good example of a really widespread high-severity burn. And so again, fires like this raise concerns about how a warming climate may interact with lower seed availability in these large high-severity patches to reduce natural regeneration. And I'm sure you're all familiar with the fact that, like other places, climate change is warming the Northwest and will continue to do so in the future unless we curb greenhouse gas emissions. And the mechanism by which climate change and wildfire may interact to impact forests is during the recovery period after fire. Following wildfires in a resilient forest, the usual sequence of events is that seed disperses into burned patches from nearby surviving trees, and seedlings establish and grow, eventually becoming a forest similar in structure and function to the one that was there previously. One concern with climate change is that instead, if we have a fire that burns particularly large patches at high severity, killing most adult trees, we may see what's called an ecological state transition, where seedlings cannot successfully establish under sufficiently arid or hot conditions. And so what was once a forest transitions to shrubland or grassland, and this is a process that's already been documented in several regions of the West. And spurred by this theory, there is a lot of work on regeneration being done recently, a lot of regeneration studies to understand where and when these processes might occur. And I would even say that this is a golden age for regeneration studies. There's a lot going on. And most of the potential state transitions that researchers have identified have been in the drier forested regions of the West, including the Southwest and in the Colorado Front Range, here where I live and work. And here in Colorado, researchers have observed limited regeneration in high-severity burn areas and determined that regeneration would be limited when seed source is beyond about 150 meters away from a burn patch. And they've also identified drier sites at elevations below 7,000 feet as those that may experience recruitment limitation. In the Northwest and the Northern Rockies, regeneration surveys have reached similar conclusions about the importance of seed availability and local climate conditions. However, thus far, most of these studies indicate that forests in the Northwest have fairly abundant post-fire regeneration and are not yet seeing frequent state transitions occur. In the Eastern Cascades, for example, regeneration declines below about 3,300 feet, which is linked to declining moisture availability. And Carrie Kemp's work in Idaho and Montana has identified a 95-meter threshold for distance to seed source, beyond which regeneration declines. But at the same time, she showed that high-severity burn patches in general aren't large enough in the area for this to be a problem, and that the forest is overall resilient thus far. But a paper she just published this year also identifies potential temperature thresholds for certain species, such as Douglas fir, where she demonstrates that Douglas fir regeneration declines above a mean summer temperature of about 17 degrees Celsius. So when I started my PhD, no widespread post-fire regeneration work had been done in the Blue Mountains of Eastern Oregon. And so I aimed to fill this knowledge gap by characterizing the abundance and species composition of post-fire regeneration. I also aimed to determine the site level and climatic factors that were driving regeneration. So I'm going to summarize some findings from that work today, and then share early results from a project funded by the Joint Fire Science Program, specifically a graduate research innovation grant, which extends this research to look at whether climate drives episodic conifer establishment in the Blue Mountains. And so, as I said, when I started my PhD, no one had looked at post-fire regeneration in the Blues. But of course, you know, this is an important topic right now. And at the same time, other folks had the same idea. So I surveyed 8 fires across the Blue Mountains in 2016 and 2017, as you can see here on this map. The gray is just forested areas. The blue dots are my transect locations. And around the same time, Will Downing, who's a master's student at OSU, Oregon State University, surveyed 4 fires as well. And we only found out about each other's work after the fact. And we only overlapped on one fire, actually, the Hash Rock fire. So this means that collectively our studies provide a really detailed look at post-fire natural regeneration in the area. And we haven't formally collaborated with our data sets, but I would encourage you to check out both of our dissertations if you're working in this region. So in the burned areas I surveyed, I constrained sampling to areas that exist, where existing vegetation maps indicate either ponderosa pine or Douglas fir dominated communities. And I stratified survey sites by north and south facing aspects, as well as satellite-derived burn severity that was later field verified. And so after I located randomly pre-selected sites, I established belt transects in each one, in which I counted seedling and sapling abundance by species. And I recorded site characteristics, including topography, and measured live and dead standing trees, and also characterized ground cover. And in total, I analyzed data from 186 transects. And so in this work, I observed extreme variability in juvenile conifer densities and different vegetation responses as well. So some sites, like the one on the left here, which was from the Hash Rock fire, had very little or no conifer regeneration, but abundant ceanothus, which is a fire-adapted shrub. Other sites where there were surviving seed sources, like the surviving ponderosa pine here, had abundant regeneration, as you can see. Other sites exhibited what may be considered regeneration failure, where they were exclusively grassland or shrubland 15 to 20 years post-fire and had no regeneration observed, while I also, at the other end of the spectrum, encountered serotinous doghair lodgepole pine stands, primarily at higher elevations. And so overall, juvenile conifer densities range from 0 to over 87,000 stems per hectare. Although most of these incredibly high density sites were serotinous lodgepole pine sites. And so I analyzed my data with those included as well as separately. And you can see there the median stems per hectare for non-serotinous sites. 1/3 of my transects contained 0 juveniles, and so I also compared densities to seedling density recommendations in Forest Service documents to the seedling density recommendations that are made for silviculturists to achieve minimum stocking levels. And when I did that analysis, and it was simply modeling whether sites met that threshold or not, a binary response, I found that, again, approximately one-third of plots were below minimum stocking level recommendations, while, of course, others, given the density data that you just saw, vastly exceeded maximum recommendations that would be given if you were replanting a site for specific silvicultural goals. And so I analyzed this data by looking at the site level and climate factors predicting the presence and absence of juvenile conifers. And I'll summarize just some of those findings for you. So I found that site level factors were more important than climate for determining the presence or absence of seedlings, saplings, both combined as just juvenile conifers generally, as well as analyzing separately by species. And the climate variables I looked at included the 30-year normals for each site, so mean annual precipitation, mean annual temperature, and I also looked at drought conditions in the years immediately following wildfire by acquiring data on different drought indices, FTEI, if you're familiar with that, as well as Ponder Drought Severity Index, just in the first 3 years post-fire to look at if they were predictive at all of regeneration presence. But again, at these sites at least, site-level factors in general were more important than regional climate or site-specific climate. And as other studies have shown, elevation was an important predictor of regeneration, both the presence of regeneration, but then also the stage of regeneration. So saplings, which I defined as taller than 1.4 meters, but with a DBH of less than 12.5 centimeters, were more likely to be found at higher elevations, which either indicates that these individuals established earlier post-fire, or that they grow more rapidly at these higher elevations, which is likely related to more productive growing conditions and higher moisture availability. And as I showed in previous photos, some sites potentially exhibited recruitment failure, and these were primarily at lower elevations where topographic heat load index was really high. So this is where sites where aridity may simply have been too high for establishment and survival to be successful. And you can see that in this box plot here, just with more frequently observing juvenile conifers at sites with a lower heat load index. And I should say this heat load index is derived from the slope, aspect, and latitude of a site. Distance to seed source was also consistently an important variable across species, again, as other studies have shown, with the probability of juvenile conifer presence declining in the first couple 100 meters away from a living seed source. So you can see here, again, this is the full distribution of seedling and sapling densities. And then zooming in on this inset here, we see this very typical steady decline in density as you get out a few hundred meters away from your closest surviving adult tree, which provides seed source. And again, the serotinous sites, those are those serotinous lodgepole sites, or the red triangles there. You can just see some of their very high densities. But I'll also point out that there were some sites which did not contain serotinous lodgepole, which also had incredibly high densities, you know, up above 10,000 stems per hectare, 20,000 stems per hectare. Many of those contained species such as larch, western larch, grand fir as well, in very high densities. But overall, the most common species I observed, which, you know, was sort of by design, focusing on ponderosa pine and Douglas fir dominated communities, were Douglas fir and ponderosa pine. But in these mixed conifer forests, you know, we saw a mix of species composition as well. So while this work, which is part of my dissertation, confirmed that post-fire natural regeneration in the Blue Mountains follows many of the same patterns that we see in other regions, without knowing the precise age of individuals that I was surveying, I could not assess the degree to which climate might affect year-to-year variation establishment. And this is key to understanding if we might see thresholds for recruitment crossed as the climate warms. And so this was the goal of the Joint Fire Science Project, which provides funds to extend some of your dissertation research. So we know that trees are vulnerable in the establishment phase with ideal temperatures, say for ponderosa pine, for emergence ranging from about 20 to 25 degrees Celsius, at least in the Northern Rockies and interior Northwest. And studies also show that increased moisture availability, so high precipitation, or in general just greater sort of moisture availability, are predictive of successful emergence. There are a few studies from Central Oregon on the factors affecting seedling mortality immediately after emergence and seedling survival within the first few years. And one experiment and observational study has shown that seedling mortality occurs immediately after spring emergence. Most of it, occurs immediately after spring emergence. So in those first sort of early summer months, as well as in the following summer. And that study also showed that shrub cover may increase seedling survival by reducing desiccation, essentially, shielding these seedlings from really high soil temperatures and from simply experiencing really high rates of evapotranspiration under high temperatures. So in the summer of 2018, I visited 8 sites across the Blue Mountains to destructively sample post-fire regeneration seedlings and saplings in order to age them. And, with this goal of looking at whether there are climatic determinants of peak establishment in this area. Other studies have used bud scar counts or branch whorls to do this in a non-destructive manner. However, studies that have compared these two methods indicate that bud scar counts or branch whorl counts can be incorrect by several years. And so to get that annually resolved data, unfortunately, you have to destructively sample seedlings. And we had several sampling constraints. A big one was that we could only sample sites where we had permission to dig, which is not a trivial thing to ask the Forest Service to allow. If you're considering any research like this, work on seeking your permissions very early in the process. Sometimes there are potential questions around archaeological potential impacts, of doing any kind of excavation. And so that's something to keep in mind with your permit applications. And so we focused our sampling on medium or high burn severity patches. And we also focused on areas where seed limitation was not a problem. Given my previous survey work, I knew that, in order to get a sufficient sample size, we would have to go to sites where there was seed source within 100 meters, and so where seed availability would not be an issue. And we aim to sample all the seedlings and saplings at a site in order to get a clear picture of the sort of a full age cohort of a burn patch, or the full cohort structure of a burn patch. And so we purposely sampled these sites with higher regeneration densities, and this will have implications for the results, which I'll discuss after I present them. So I returned to 2 of the fires that I had previously surveyed, the Wheeler Point fire and the Summit fire. However, again, from these previous surveys, I knew that many of the saplings regenerating these fires after 20 plus years post-fire were actually too big to dig up and to age accurately. And so I selected 2 more recent fires, the Thorn Creek and the Egley Complex fires as well. And again, we avoided areas, as I had in my previous surveys, where there was any post-fire logging or planting. Yeah. So at each site, we recorded site characteristics, including elevation, aspect, distance to seed source, float position, canopy cover, all of those important variables that may affect regeneration. And we dug up all of the Douglas fir and ponderosa pine seedlings and saplings, and we just focused on those 2 species to keep our sample straightforward. And we only actually surveyed sites with those 2 species, so that also kept things simple. And so we dug these up within a variable area plot, aiming to achieve a minimum sample size of 30 seedlings per site. And we measured their height and diameter, as well as shrub cover, whether they were growing within a shrub or overtopped by a shrub. And we had dug up each seedling and cut their stem to about 15 centimeters, both below ground level, so getting about 15 centimeters of that root tissue, as well as 15 centimeters above, in order to capture that root shoot boundary, which is really what you need to accurately age these seedlings. And in the lab, we cut each sample into about 4 sections, about 2.5 centimeters each, in order to do our ring count. So again, as I have discussed, in order to age a tree to annual resolution, you generally need to do ring counts at the point just before the stem tissue transitions to root tissue. And so this is why if you core a tree and take a core higher on the stem, the higher up the tree you go, the more years you will be off in terms of the establishment date of that tree. 15% of the stems that we sampled were too large to be dug out of the ground, and so we did core those, and we cored them as close to the root shoot boundary as we could by coring close to the ground, often sort of digging out a hole so we could get and so we could access, the stem pretty low down. And so we mounted cores and disc samples in the lab, and we sanded them down with progressively finer sandpaper up to 600 grit. And then we aged disc samples to the precise establishment year under a microscope. And the way that we determined the establishment year was that, we counted backwards from 2018, which is the year that all of these were sampled. And for each of the 4 samples, for each seedling, we selected the establishment year of the sample just before the pith disappears into the root tissue. So when you're looking down the microscope at these guides, theoretically the root shoot boundary is precisely where the visible pith disappears. Root tissue does not have a clear pith as stem tissue does. And so you can use that transition zone to identify the precise establishment year. And so we counted rings on the cores that we sampled, as well as the disc samples where we did not reach root tissue. And we considered these minimum establishment year estimates. And I'll present results showing both of these, both the precise annually resolved ages as well as these minimum age estimates as qualitative results, but I only use the precise age estimates for the climate analyses that I'll present. So in total, we sampled 343 juvenile conifers, 2/3 being ponderosa pine, and we precisely aged 2/3 of this sample, and we determined minimum establishment years for a further quarter of samples. And I'll just point out that with these 2/3 of samples that we precisely aged to annual resolution, just to show you how finicky the task of annual resolution aging is, just within the 4 sections of an individual seedling, on average, those 4 sections differed in their ring counts by a year and a half or up to 2 years. So again, just, it sort of impresses upon all of us, that if we want to do this annual resolution work, we have to be really sort of diligent about the ring counts that we're doing and doing, inter-counter reliability and that kind of thing. So here's some of the early results. So here are the age structures for the 4 fires with both species combined. And the black rectangles indicate the fire year. And the establishment years are shown in blue with the minimum establishment years. So those, again, are for samples that we had to core or samples where we did not reach the sort of pith, non-pith juncture. And right away, you can see that rather than demonstrating very clear episodic recruitment appears to be fairly continuous across all 4 sites. And this continuous recruitment echoes findings from Will Downing's master's work. So Will Downing did count whorl counts and bud scars during his non-destructive sampling. And again, while whorl count data has been shown to be unreliable for precisely aging seedlings, his age distributions also show continuous establishment rather than clear episodic regeneration. So it lends some credibility to the continuous recruitment that my samples are showing as well. And potential establishment peaks become somewhat more evident when we look at species separately. So this is ponderosa pine, and you can start to see that, okay, there may be some establishment peaks years where the majority of establishment, or not majority, but a large proportion of establishment happened at specific sites. And then here is Douglas fir as well. And so in order to analyze whether there were any true establishment peaks that were driven by climate, I used a simple filtering method And this filtering method was used by Monica Rother and Tom Veblen, who did similar work here in the Colorado Front Range. And this filtering method essentially identifies years where a given percentage of samples established. And so I used filters of 10% of samples and 5% of samples. And so these are years where more than 10% or more than 5% of precisely aged samples, so again, I'm only using the annually resolved data here, established in individual sites as well as both sites combined for each fire. So it had to meet both requirements that, this was a substantial proportion of samples, substantial proportion of juveniles had established that year in separate sites within the same fire, as well as both those sites taken together. And so then I downloaded climate data for each of those post-fire years and compared climate data between peak establishment years and non-peak years using a Mann-Whitney U-test. And I repeated this analysis by species as well. Now, because of the small sample size, I limited this analysis to just sites from Thorn Creek and the Egley complex fires, because those were the fires where we had sufficient annually resolved age data to complete the analyses. So I tested growing season, monthly total precipitation, mean, minimum, and maximum temperature, again, for each month, April to October, I should say, for growing season, as well as summer vapor pressure deficit. So that was for June, July, and August, averaged across those months. And while I found few significant differences between peak establishment years and non-peak establishment years, for both species combined, high establishment years using a 5% filter generally had lower maximum June temperatures, as you can see here in this with this box plot. And so this aligns with our theoretical understanding of the vulnerability of seedlings to desiccation early on, just after emergence. But given the small sample size, I would not draw broad conclusions from this finding. I also saw a difference in total September precipitation for Douglas fir, PSME. However, intuitively, I saw more Douglas fir establishment in years in these two fires where there's actually lower September precipitation, which is somewhat unintuitive. These age data, both the annually resolved ages as well as the minimum establishment ages, are very useful when combined with height and diameter data that we collected for developing growth curves of this natural regeneration following fires. So here I'm showing growth curves. Again, this is the data from those 4 fires, Wheeler Point, Summit, Thorn Creek, and the Egley Complex fire, which demonstrates how quickly some of these naturally generating seedlings and saplings can grow in the Blue Mountains. Some of them after 15 years, they're essentially close to 15 feet tall, getting up to 20 feet tall after 20 years. It's in centimeters here, but I'm converting for those of you who work in feet. And I think an important implication of these growth curves, again, this is natural regeneration, is for fuel managers, because it's saying that after 15 years, juveniles may have diameters of 5 centimeters or more. And there has been some research done on the mortality rate of seedlings and saplings when prescribed fires are actually used to reduce these fuels on the landscapes. And there's one study, it's actually from the Black Hills of South Dakota, so it may not be very applicable in the Blue Mountains, but that study by Mike Battaglia and his colleagues indicated that once you get a sapling with a diameter greater than 5 centimeters, mortality rates decline below about 30% for saplings in a typical prescribed fire. And so managers, this suggests that fuel treatments earlier on in sites, before 15 years has passed post-fire for those sites with really productive regeneration may be necessary. And this also just points out to those sort of size thresholds that I was using. So about after 12 years, most seedlings are transitioning to sapling height. And again here, after about 20 years, you start to get saplings transitioning to sort of full tree size. So overall, these data on, with annually resolved ages of regeneration suggest that there's no clear definitive climate-mediated recruitment limitation at these specific sites. But the results perhaps aren't surprising for a few reasons. For one thing, we don't have site-specific year data on seed production. We don't know when cone crops at these sites occurred, and therefore we can't use this as a control in these analyses. And for the more recent fires, the ones that burned in 2006 or 2007, there haven't been very many years elapsed, only potentially 12 years between the fire and sampling. And so therefore, that's only 12 years of climate variability. And so it's perhaps not enough years of post-fire climate to really see the full effects of climate on establishment peaks. And there's a few other issues here, and I hope that some of this discussion, can be helpful takeaways for folks considering doing this type of research, or even specifically doing work in the Blue Mountains to understand some of these processes. So, we have the key kind of chicken and egg issue where we targeted sampling sites with sufficiently abundant regeneration to gain sufficient sample sizes. So, this meant that we were purposely sampling sites that were productive enough, to have relatively high densities. We were not sampling sites that were near climatic thresholds for these species, where we might expect to see more episodic regeneration happening. And I'll talk a little bit more in a second about evidence that we have that suggests that's very much the case. So to kind of hammer this point home, this is the 1981 to 2010 normal climate moisture deficit for all of the sites that I surveyed across those 8 fires initially. So this is 186 sites across the Blue Mountains. And CMD just simply characterizes sort of the general wetness to dryness of sites. And you can see that the CMD of the sites of the 4 fires that I aged falls kind of squarely in the middle here of the full sort of moisture distribution for the region. Additionally, so again, this is not at the climatic threshold for ponderosa pine and for Douglas fir. I'll also point out that Will Downing's work, he surveyed those 4 fires that were generally at the wetter end of the spectrum, and he generally concluded that there's very abundant regeneration happening in the blues post-fire, and that they are very resilient to fire, and I think that's something to keep in mind as well, that many of those sites were at the higher end of the moisture spectrum. And so again, to talk a little bit about, why we may be seeing continuous regeneration at these sites that we surveyed, there's this great paper that just came out in the last couple of months by Kim Davis and colleagues, perhaps some folks on this call, in PNAS, which is a meta-analysis of similar aging studies from across the West. And I really, really wish this paper had come out before we planned this study and carried it out. But it actually provides some really wonderful, sort of fodder for thinking about these issues. And I'm also hopeful that this small data set we have, although small, can contribute to meta-analysis efforts like this and sort of fill in a gap that currently exists for data specifically from the Blue Mountains. And so in that paper, Kim Davis and colleagues, they did demonstrate using aging data that goes back further in time and from the entire West, from Southwest through to the Northwest, that we are seeing distinct thresholds for recruitment based on temperature and moisture. And specifically in the Northern Rockies, the conditions over the last 20 years have crossed these thresholds for ponderosa pine and Douglas fir at times, reducing the probability of recruitment. And I'll just show you one figure from their paper, which demonstrates declining recruitment probabilities for ponderosa pine in the Northern Rockies. And A on the top there is just within the first 5 years post-fire, and B on the bottom there is within the first 10 years post-fire. And the Northern Rockies here are just shown in the green line right there, and R. So you can see those declines. And they also showed, and this is really helpful for explaining some of the findings from this study, that in the Northern Rockies, post-fire establishment is indeed more continuous at wetter sites and more episodic at the driest sites in the region. So again, on the left here, we have the 10 wettest ponderosa pine-dominated sites that they included in their meta-analysis from the Northern Rockies. And you can see here that these sites, generally have sort of more continuous establishment, whereas in the 10 driest sites, we have more sort of clear establishment peaks, again indicating that climatic thresholds exist in those sites and are a primary factor determining establishment, whereas they are much less so when conditions are climatically favorable for species establishment. So bringing that back to this work, again, it's perhaps not surprising given the range of sites that we sampled that we are seeing this continuous regeneration. And so I think this raises a couple interesting questions. One is that, as climate change continues and as warming continues, thresholds may become clearer in places like the Blue Mountains, which currently are not as vulnerable to thresholds as, say, places in the Southwest or in the Colorado Front Range. And I think the Blue Mountains is also a really interesting place to look for these thresholds because topographic controls in the Blue Mountains relating to, the heat load index that I discussed earlier, where you see very little regen happening on those hot, steep south-facing slopes, those controls are already really strong. And so as the climate warms, we may see an interaction between those topographic characteristics and warming temperatures and higher evapotranspiration that causes, thresholds to be overcome in sites like that. So again, future studies in this region and others should focus on areas that may be vulnerable to these thresholds being crossed. Before you plan your sampling, you should look at the historic moisture sort of distribution of sites in your area before deciding how to stratify your sampling if this is a question that you're really interested in. Another really important point for future research of this kind is to ensure that sample sizes are sufficient to answer these questions. I would say that given the challenges of precisely aging samples, especially the fact that seedlings do have to be below a certain size for you to, successfully excavate in order to get that annually resolved year, I would say that, sample sizes to shoot for should be at least 300 samples per species to accurately evaluate regional climate-driven establishment peaks. And moving forward, personally, I haven't incorporated very much, really any climate data into my analysis, soil data into my analysis so far. That's generally being because the SERGO data is incomplete for my study regions in the Blue Mountains. But I've just become aware of Polaris and some other soil databases that may be useful for adding soils into these analyses and trying to clarify, the role of soil moisture as other studies have done. So to conclude, for those managers in the audience, to start talking about, well, why does all this matter? How is it useful for potentially informing forest management decisions? All of this recent regeneration survey work in the Blue Mountains suggests that natural regeneration may be limited in areas beyond about 100 meters from a live seed source, and at lower elevations on hot sites. So again, those steep south-facing sites. And so in those areas, replanting may be needed to retain forest cover. However, I think it's also an interesting discussion, you know, with projected warming. We should also be thinking about allowing some areas to either persist as meadow potentially, or thinking about replanting at lower densities. And I've chatted with some silviculturists who are already very on board with this. I know that some of those, you know, recalibrations of recommended densities are already taking place. Yeah, again, in places where natural regeneration, you know, fails to meet stocking recommendations, planting may be necessary, but because it's so expensive, I do think these discussions about, you know, sort of where, when, and how much, given future projections, is useful for, you know, enhancing efficiency around post-fire management. And at the other end of the spectrum, the trees and dry mixed conifer forests in the Blue Mountains, you know, they evolved with frequent fire, and so therefore they've evolved to establish and grow quickly post-fire. And so this means that in more productive sites in the Blue Mountains, natural regeneration can quickly lead to really high fuel continuity. The growth curves that I presented showing sort of how quickly, you know, these guys get, you know, above 15 feet tall, you know, how quickly their diameters are increasing. It means that if there needs to be prescribed fire to reduce regeneration, to reduce fuel densities in the years following fire, it may need to take place sort of within those first 15 years if you do have some really productive sites. And I'll also say that the growth curves I presented today, when used, I was thinking of for them could potentially be to parameterize regional cohort-based forest landscape models such as Landis 2. So please contact me if you would like any specific pieces of data. So with that, I'll leave some time for questions, and I would like to thank my colleagues on the Communities and Forests in Oregon project, which was a project I initially joined when I started my PhD here, and includes current and former staff of Oregon State University Extension and Eastern Oregon-based WILAW resources, as well as my dissertation committee members. I'd like to thank them, and my field assistants, of which there are many. These are just two, Noah Goodkind and Zach Schwartz, I would like to thank for helping me dig up seedlings this past summer in the Blue Mountains. And I would also like to thank staff from the Umatilla and Malheur National Forests who provided sampling permission and assisted with project development. And so again, funding for this research was provided by USDA, C. Boulder, and the Joint Fire Science Program.
Great,
so
thank you, Angela.
Oh, sorry. Can I just say one more thing?
Yeah.
So the final project report for the Joint Fire Science Program project will be available within the next couple of months, and my broader regeneration study will be published on a similar timeline. So please email me if you'd like to know when both are available. And in the meantime, my dissertation is available. So again, email me if you would like that directly. You can also find it online by just searching my name. And it contains the regeneration findings discussed in the first portion. So with that, I'll take any questions. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Angela. And so a question did come in early on, and I apologize, I didn't write down which slide it was associated with. But the question was, what percentage of the regen was grand fir versus ponderosa or lodgepole?
Great question. So I have those numbers, I think, generally off the top of my head because I'm just so good at this manuscript yet. So 40 some odd, well, so it depends. I'd have to dig deeper, and the person, please ask them to contact me to get the specific percentages, you know, within certain fires. But of all seedlings sampled, to get specific numbers across all seedlings sampled and within certain fires. But in terms of the percentage of sites that had each of the species, the most widespread species was ponderosa pine. So 40-something% of sites had ponderosa pine. About a third of sites, I think, or more, it might have been around 36% of sites had Douglas fir. 24% of sites, I think, had grand fir. and then it sort of goes down the line. So only 12% of sites had that serotinous lodgepole pine response, and those were primarily on the tower fire, if you're familiar with the area at all, as well as on the bull fire, both of which are, well, the bull's actually in a wilderness area. They're both fairly high elevation. And, but in general, it was, ponderosa pine, Douglas fir, some grand fir in moister sites, and then a smattering of larch, juniper, and a tiny bit of Engelmann spruce in some of the high elevation sites, but very little. But again, feel free to contact me for the specific numbers or for specific fires.
Okay, great. And just to reiterate, yes, that this webinar has been recorded, and I will archive it on our website and YouTube channels. And so while you're thinking about your questions for Angela, I do have a quick question here, Angela. Did you happen to look at deer browse or any other herbivory impacts in your regeneration surveys?
Yeah, we did actually. So we recorded, damage if there was apical meristem damage on the seedlings and saplings, and we also recorded actually dropping counts. So, this is for ungulates in general, both elk and deer, to look at whether either of those things affected the number of seedlings and saplings that we were seeing at sites. And while it didn't affect abundance, as far as I can tell, in wells, the heights of seedlings in sites with high numbers of ungulate droppings were actually lower. So, it suggests that ungulates have some sort of herbivory pressure, where they are reducing the heights of these various species. Also, I did count brown squirrels, but didn't use that data, to approximate age. And none of that, branch squirrels were also, increased by the amount of herbivory that was going on. So there was more droppings at a site and more herbivory happening. Plants branch when the apical meristem is damaged, and so that's another way that branch squirrels or bud scars, I think that data can be sort of misleading if there hasn't been damage to the tree initially.
Mm-hmm. Okay, as you're thinking about your questions and getting them in, I want to make a quick announcement that if you aren't already aware, the Joint Fire Science Program has announced its funding opportunities, which includes the GRIN, which Angela here has helped fund her project. That opportunity will close on May 16th, so get your proposals in if you're thinking about applying to that. And I'll put the link here in the chat box. There it is, to the Joint Fire Science Program website. The information about the opportunities are on their website. So I'm not seeing any other questions come in. I also want to say again that we're having 2 more webinars coming up this spring on May 7th, an outlook for the 2019 fire season in Oregon and Washington, and on May 9th, what's new in land fire, remap. So go ahead and tune into those. You can find both of those webinars on our website, the information and the registration link. And then also just at the end, there's a super short survey for this webinar that I encourage you to take. That information you provide helps us to measure impact from the webinar that you just listened to. As well, it offers an opportunity for you to list future webinars that you'd like us to host. So please do take that survey. It really helps out. I don't see any other questions coming in. So at this point, I guess I just want to thank you, Angela, for taking time to talk with us. And also for those of you who participated today in this webinar, thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules. Angela, that was wonderful. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks so much, Carrie. Thanks, everyone.
All right. Have a great rest of your day. Bye.